It is the autumn of 2001. You are sitting up in bed with a cup of tea, watching the television. You are sitting in bed because it is the middle of the night, and on your television screen you see a group of riders charging across the screen. They are made up of 4 US Special Forces warriors and a group of Afghanistan tribal warlords, and they are in pursuit of the Taliban and Al-Qaeda. And what you are witnessing is the most enduring military weapon system in action after 3,000 years, still going strong. For 3,000 years, from Alexander the Great in the 4th century BCE to General Allenby's successful Palestine campaign 2,200 years later in the same part of the world, as long as strength mattered and size mattered, as long as vital transport to the battlefield hadn't been motorized, and most importantly, before the terror-inducing boom of big guns, the psychological impact of possibly 2,000 horses thundering towards you at 40 miles per hour in choking clouds of dust, with all the noise of chariots, the roar from throats of the cavalrymen, the trumpets, the horse and rider inspired fear. All this shock effect meant that most cavalry charges were won or lost before the two sides met, unless the will to fight had been instilled in the men by discipline and experience. Napoleon said, "Cavalry's main weapon is fear." And God said, in Deuteronomy chapter 20, addressing the Israelites, "When you go to war against your enemies and see horses and chariots and an army greater than yours, do not be afraid, because the Lord your God is with you." Now, horses are prey animals whose instinct is to flee from anything frightening, not to run towards the source of their anxiety, where every sound and smell and sight tells them, run. So lengthy and expensive training was necessary for both horse and rider, and the success of cavalry depended on the care and management of the horse and its equipment. A horse, my kingdom for a horse. That is how a battle was won or lost, by the fact that there was no horse. Xenophon in the 4th century wrote a cavalry manual used for 2 millennia and still very relevant. Much earlier, from the 14th century BCE, a training manual for the conditioning of chariot horses found at the Hittite capital Hattusa, recommended by its author, the master horse trainer Kukuli, a 6-month regime of stabling, grooming, feeding, exercising, including swimming. Domestication of the horse goes back to 4000 BCE amongst nomadic tribes north of the Black Sea, and we have excavations at Terevka in the Ukraine revealing horse bits from approximately this date. I'm sorry to say to anyone who like me, is extremely fond of horses, that their first use as a domestic animal was without doubt for food. The first appearance of the horse in battle was as a chariot steed. Mules could be and were used in this capacity, but much slower. And if your mule-drawn chariot met a horse-drawn one, well, guess who won? Chariots were in use in battle by the 3rd millennium in the ancient Near East. We have a battle standard from the city of Ur showing a battle wagon, solid wood with solid wooden wheels, heavy, unmaneuverable, and begging for a design upgrade. Drawn by 2 or more, typically 4 horses, it was extremely good at its job. You pointed it at the enemy infantry, and simply ran them over, finishing off with your javelin anyone who hadn't been crushed to death. It was shock and awe, big time. The Egyptians improved the chariot greatly, making it lighter and more flexible with spoked wheels and needing only 2 horses. And of course each chariot had a driver and a javelin thrower or an archer. Most probably the reason why chariots developed before mounted troops was simply that the horses were too small to be ridden. Most horses at this point were still only 10 to 12 hands high, the size of a small pony. The biggest Assyrian chariot horses were still only 14'2", but the Egyptians had truly impressive horses of around 16 hands. That's about the size of a modern-day hunter. The sort of horses that I still have one. She just eats grass now, but she's about 16 hands. Organization by breed in the modern sense didn't exist in the ancient world, and it's more useful to talk about size and conformation, the important distinction being between riding horses and chariot horses. The Assyrians kept records of horse type based on size and utility. As early as the 17th century, with the invention of the composite bow and penetrating bronze arrowheads, the war chariot became the most lethal weapon in existence. Most Bronze Age battles were chariot contests, such as at Megiddo and Kadesh. Now, the transition from chariot to cavalry was a pivotal point in history. By the early 9th century, the Assyrians had the first organized mounted force under Ashur-nasirpal II, who reigned from 883 to 859. And, you know, I'm sure you've all seen the friezes in various museums and things of the Assyrians in pairs. They were all shown in pairs, the mounted warriors as archers, very stylized, with little conical hats on their heads. So they went in pairs. 150 years later, the crucial point was reached. Assyrian cavalry wore armor and carried long spears instead of javelins or bows, which needed close contact to be effective. Unlike the infantryman, the mounted warrior could ride in quickly to disable the chariot, to slash at the horse's legs or cut the reins, or hit the horse over the eyes, because that's really the only way you can kill a horse easily, is to whack it over the head, you know, with an axe or something. Then flee. In effect, the superior killing capacity of the mounted horseman made the chariot obsolete. In Israel and Judah, this transition was complete by the end of the 8th or early 7th century. The smaller, narrow-backed horse in Israel, as compared to the broad, big-bone Egyptian chariot horse, facilitated the mounted warrior, because what you want to achieve riding is the closest possible contact between you and the horse. And if you've got a very big, broad-backed horse, like a huge Egyptian chariot horse, it's a little bit like you know, the Thelwell cartoons of the ponies with the little girls with their legs sticking straight out sideways. You're not going to stay on that for very long. Good riding, and this brings us to the point that good riding does not require a saddle or stirrups. So that glimpse that I had in the National Museum, because I am a rider, didn't actually make a lot of sense to me, that the Battle of Kinsale was largely won because the English had stirrups and the Irish didn't, because the very best riders can ride bareback or just on a saddle pad. Witness the Native Americans. They were fantastic. And the Asian steppe riders, they created this symbiotic oneness with the horse, where you can feel every movement. Assyrian reliefs show their cavalrymen sitting on saddle pads. Now, the skin of the horse is so sensitive that it can feel the smallest insect on any part of its body. And I really feel sorry for them in the summer in Glen Cree, our horses anyway, because they are plagued by flies and midges. You can see their skins rippling, just trying to get rid of them. This sensitivity, coupled with intelligence and a good memory, makes it possible to train a horse to be guided by hands, by the use of legs, the use of body weight, and the voice, the so-called natural aids. It's possible to have this symbiotic relationship with the horse, the rider and the mount molded together, moving as one. The use of a saddle actually interferes with this close contact with your horse. And it's interesting that the Romans, although they rode without stirrups, developed a rigid frame four-horn saddle that kept them secure but distanced them from contact. Of course, toe stirrups had been developed as early as the 2nd century in India and on the Asian steppes in the 5th and 6th century made of wood or iron. But I'm going to make a leap here that may really not be justified. The Romans, as you know, had this fantastically efficient fighting machine. Their army, their infantry, was absolutely unparalleled from its discipline and its ability to maneuver, even with large groups of men. But they never made good cavalrymen. And I like to think two things. One is much more possible, that this was because of the lack of contact with the horse. But I think it may also have contributed to the limiting, I mean, there are a lot of other reasons, but the limiting of their empire. They never developed really effective cavalry. So, the transition from chariotry to cavalry is traceable in the Bible. Isaiah cites chariot warfare with reference to Assyria, Egypt, and Elam. While Elam bore the quiver in troops of mounted men, and Kue bared the shield, and your choicest lowlands were filled with chariots and horsemen. This is Isaiah. Later on, by the late 7th and early 6th century, Jeremiah says, "They sound like the roaring sea as they ride on their horses." And Ezekiel even later says, "You and many nations with you, all of them riding on horses, a great horde, a mighty army." When the first Israelite exiles returned from Babylon in 458 to 455, they were accompanied by Persian cavalry, not chariots. And roughly at the same time, we have the dreaded Haman from the Esther story, suggesting that the man the king wished to honor should be led through the streets on the king's own horse, not a triumphal chariot procession. Now, almost every book in the Hebrew Bible features horses and chariots in some way or other, usually in a military context. Horses, chariots, and horsemen were so much in evidence during the monarchic period that they inspired both poets and prophets, and their place in the life and culture of biblical Israel was central. For example, we have evidence of trading and buying or hiring of horses. In Deuteronomy 17, it's interesting, it's a kind of negative proof, if you like, but the people are told, the king must not make people return to Egypt to get more horses. Well, more horses? They must have gone the first time. And it must have been a serious enough thing to be told, don't do it. And Isaiah, in Isaiah 31, and the context of this is he's reproving Hezekiah. You'll see what for, and it's the Assyrians are massing. They're about to descend and besiege and attack Jerusalem. So Isaiah says, "Ha! Those who go down to Egypt for help and rely upon horses, they have put their trust in abundance of chariots, in vast numbers of riders, and they've not turned to the Holy One of Israel." So clearly this was possibly Hezekiah's policy, that you applied to Egypt for horses. There is some academic opinion that feels that they may even have hired the Egyptians as mercenaries to come with the chariots and the horses and the drivers and fight on their side against Assyria, which was quite possible. There were lots of different combinations of fighting coalitions. But the large... Yes. So the place of the horse in Israel was central, yet very little attention is paid to their importance by historians or biblical scholars. But the large number of horses referenced in biblical description of battles would necessitate an infrastructure, an agricultural policy, and even taxation, not to mention a large labor force, and a conscripted army. All of these consequences were foreseen by the prophet Samuel, or if you prefer, by the writers of the text who lived actually afterwards, but that's not what we're going to address tonight. So all of this was foreseen, or seen in retrospect, by the prophet Samuel when he tried to dissuade the Israelites from having a king. He warned the people, "This will be the practice of the king who rules over you. He will take your sons and appoint them as his charioteers and horsemen, and they will serve as outrunners for his chariots. He will appoint them as his chiefs of thousands and fifties, or they will have to plough his fields, reap his harvest, and make his weapons and the equipment for his chariots." The list went on, with a tenth of everything going as tax to the king, and forced labour for all. Now, contrary to much scholarly opinion, there is much evidence to show that horses were plentiful and chariots ubiquitous. Although to date we have no pictorial evidence in Israel of warfare, Aramean, Egyptian and Assyrian artwork, inscriptions and monuments all attest the presence of Israel and her horses on the battlefield. Stables dating to the 9th and 10th century have been identified at numerous places in Israel, at Megiddo, Tel Kasile, Tel Abu Hawan, Kinrot, and in Judah at Lachish, Tel Nassos, Tel Mahata, Tel El Hesi, Bet Shemesh, and Beersheba. According to the Assyrian account, excuse me for this, I had a technological meltdown and I've got stuff everywhere in hand. Yes, the fortresses at Beersheba in Judah. And Iron Age fortresses in Israel and Judah were designed with horse care and management priority. There was favourable terrain, good and abundant water and pasturage, stables, convenient hitching chambers, large training centres. Now, the business about the hitching is very interesting. I don't know if any of you are Formula One watchers, but in these forts, fortified places that I've referred to, they all had walls, obviously, and they had gates. And in the gates, and this is particularly true at Megiddo, I mean, they're everywhere, but the ones at Megiddo are in particularly good condition. And you know the way a gate is deep. I mean, even if you go in the Jaffa Gate in Jerusalem, you walk through a kind of tunnel. So there's sort of solid tower on either side, so to speak. Well, in ancient Israel, what there were in those solid blocks on either side of the actual archway were 6 or sometimes only 4 bays, either 2 or 3 on each side, going that way, going across. You know, your entrance is there, and these bays are like that at right angles. Now, what those were for, we're convinced, is unhitching the chariot horses and putting in fresh ones. Because if you do know anything about horses, the most difficult thing is to tack them and untack them in the open. It's much easier to do it in a confined space, either in a stable or a shed, or even tying them up helps, but it's much better. And they are exactly the right size. Now, there are also a lot of other things at Megiddo that for someone like myself who is a horse person finds very, very convincing, that there's no question that these 450 stables were used as stables. Now, for the last 50 years, up until very recently, there was this big academic hoo-ha that's the stables of Megiddo, they were storerooms, they were this, they were that, they had nothing to do with horses. But interestingly enough, when finally the debate was resolved in 1998 and 2000, when during the excavation season, when a whole troop of horse experts was asked to join the archaeologists, and no question, no contest. This was clearly stuff that was meant for the care of horses. And the rapid, it's like the guys coming into the pit stop and getting the tires changed. You want to get back on the battlefield. Because a horse at that level of exertion could only function for an hour. And then he had to be. And that was another reason why it was so convincing that there were many, many horse depots, if you like, in Israel. Because the wonderful thing was the distance is small. The very smallest of the country adds to this effect that you're within 20 miles. None of these places are more than 20 miles. I mean, obviously the ones that are in the north are more than 20 miles from ones in the south. But there's like a 20 miles between the nearest ones. So you were really covered very well for being able to get back and get a fresh horse. Now the Assyrians, on the other hand, had to sometimes march for 6 weeks to even get to where their battle was, so there was something to be said for being small. Now, yes, so it all catered for the army's most valuable weapon, the horse. According to the Syrian account on a monolith, the Kurt monolith, Ahab, king of Israel, fielded the largest chariotry in a battle, 2,000 chariots with 4,000 to 6,000 horses at the Battle of Karkar. Now, if you are suspect of numbers in the Bible, which most of us are, and with good reason, but just bear this in mind. Although this number may seem large, consider in 1914, the British Army alone mobilized 140,000 horses in the first 10 days of the war. In World War II, the Russians fielded 1.2 million war horses. Back to World War I, the Desert Mounted Corps deployed to push Turks out of Israel in the Palestine campaign and stationed 25,000 horses under Allenby at various places in Israel. Megiddo alone had 450 horses. But you see, once trained, horses don't need to be kept in stables. They go back out to pasture. The mares and foals are at pasture. So, although it's difficult to put an exact figure, there probably were several thousand horses in Israel alone, not counting Judah. Now, interestingly enough, before the monarchic period, horses don't appear very much. They certainly don't appear on the wealth lists of the patriarchs and Job, and they really don't appear until Solomon and Absalom. You know, because when they're listing the possessions that everyone had, there'd be donkeys and sheep and all sorts of things, camels, but no horses. But during the monarchic period, the horses became the key players, actually in the survival of the nation. At any given time during the 9th and 10th century, horses were the single most important force between Israel and annihilation. If Israel had been a nation of only a few hundred horses, it would have been wiped out by the surrounding peoples who possessed superb armies with thousands of horses. Situated as she was at the center of the ancient Near East, over which neighbors competed, Aram, Egypt, Assyria, all vied to expand their boundaries and gain control of valuable trade routes. Israel and Judah developed and maintained statehood by facing them with their own chariots and mounted warriors. Perhaps, who knows, without their horses, Israel and Judah may not have existed long enough to be remembered. To the Irish section. The origins of the Irish are difficult to pin down, but we can accept that the Keltoi or Celts arrived about 700 BCE, possibly fleeing German and Roman expansion in northern Europe. The last of the groups to arrive were the Gaels, who were a small but powerful group of warriors, whose discovered material remains would scarcely fill a wheelbarrow. But they presumably did what most invaders do. They killed and dispossessed and or levied tribute. But what is certain is that by the 1st century of the Common Era, the Gaels were top dogs. Their language, laws, and culture ruled. Powerful they were, but a hopelessly divided bunch of squabblers. This petty but lethal ceaseless bickering has provoked the following description. In the long period from the fall of Rome in the West until the end of the 11th century, there was little warfare, but much violence in Ireland. War, if we accept the definition as legal violence carried out by a state, through large standing professional armies, can only exist if the state is big enough to raise taxes to pay the army. In pre-Norman Ireland, kings were able to exact tribute only sufficient to support a small group of household warriors, in time supplemented by mercenaries. And much of the violence portrayed in the Irish annals is a record of feuds and rivalries amongst the many, many kinglets. In the Middle Ages in Ireland, armed conflict was an obligation of class. Only women, slaves, and clerics could avoid fighting. Free-born men, particularly nobles, lived in a state where there was no clear-cut division between war and peace. Rather than set-piece battles, Irish violence of raiding or harrying, such as the annals describe, between the O'Neill and their rivals, in which the horse played a vital part, both in the attacking and seizing the cattle of the captives who became slaves, and in the transporting or herding the booty home. Now, this was not a gentlemanly leisure activity in which a few cattle would be removed from the neighbours, who would then steal them back, great exercise for the men, if not much fun for the cows, but a seriously destructive activity with much loss of life. On the other hand, according to the War Against the Foreigners, one of the pseudo-historic writings that supplement the information in the annals, there were pitched battles fought on open plains for the capture of the Hiberno-Norse towns of Limerick and Dublin. Although the brevity of the entries in our principal contemporary source for the 5th to 11th century, the Annals of Ireland, doesn't give the gory details, we can consider the English version of similar raiding. William the Conqueror's famous harrying of the north in 1069, which left huge tracts of land to the north and west of York, completely desolate for 20 years, according to the Domesday Book. Now, ordinary fighting men in this era had a spear and a shield, while nobles had swords as well, but they went into battle without mail shirts or helmets. Like the Vikings, they tended to use their horses to carry them to battle, where they dismounted to fight on foot. However, a feature of the armed struggle recorded in the 12th century annals, which is not present in the War of the Irish against the Foreigners, is the record of the presence of mounted combatants in the large armies of that century, e.g. in 1167, at the Convention of Athboy, summoned to confirm Rory O'Connor, King of Connaught, as High King, there were 19,000 horsemen from all over Ireland. And again later that year, Rory summoned 7 battalions of horse soldiers. Another 12th century pseudo-historical work, the Book of Rights, enumerated the weaponry and at least one piece of armour, a breastplate, as part of a stipend from a superior to an inferior in exchange for military service. Most detailed is the listing of horses as part of the stipend, and not just for war, but horses for the road, that is ordinary travel, horses for hosting, that is gatherings possibly for fighting but for other reasons as well, for racing. So the St. Stephen's Day meeting at Leopardstown, perhaps that has a much earlier origin than we think. They also talked about horses from abroad, from France and from Scotland. Now, although Giraldus Cambrensis claims that the Irish had no saddles and fought naked, the Book of Rights lists saddles and bridles as part of the noble stipend army pay, and we mustn't forget that Giraldus had an axe to grind. Some of his relations accompanied Strongbow. Now, an important point equally for the pre-Norman period and for after 1169 is that the conflict was never black and white. That is, it wasn't always Irish versus Viking or Irish versus Normans. The Battle of Clontarf in 1014 didn't mark the climax of the struggle between Vikings, who had been permanent neighbours since 830, and Gael. nor was it the foiling of a Scandinavian takeover bid for the sovereignty of the island. It was actually provoked by a quite normal Irish scenario, a rebellion of a lesser provincial king, in this case Leinster, against the High King, Brian Boru, who was also King of Munster. On Brian's team were his own army of Munster, plus contingents of the Hiberno-Norse of Limerick and Waterford. Batting for Leinster were the Hiberno-Norse King of Dublin, with the addition of mercenaries from Scotland and the Isle of Man. Similarly, once the English arrived, there were Irish participants in most early Anglo-Norman armies. Richard de Clare, Earl of Pembroke, as Dermot MacMurrough's successor as King of Leinster, never fought without Irish troops, and vice versa. A Norman, Maurice de Prendergast, was hired first by Dermot and then by the King of Ossory. By 1297, there was an Irish statute that said everyone worth £20 a year. That means anyone with land that produced an income of £20 had to provide a hobby, that is, a small horse. And the people riding them, the Irish riding them, were called hobblars. And they rode to war, but dismounted to fight in pitched battles, obviously in the predominant feature of raiding and harrying, that you remain on your horse. In 1309, Irish nobles serving Donogh O'Brien handed over their horses to horseboys to lead them to the rear. Now, men were as little as £3, 6 shillings and 8 pence were expected to have a horse as well, showing the importance of small horses in swift-moving raids in difficult terrain. In England, only those worth £15 had to have a horse, so there were a lot fewer ordinary people on horses in England than there were in Ireland. The horse was much more important here. The High Middle Ages in Ireland saw increasing reliance on mercenaries. And from the mid-13th century, Gaelic lords in Ulster and Connaught had been bringing in Scots mercenaries. When Edward I went to war with the Scots in 1296, the traffic went the other way. Edward was so impressed by the hobblars' performance in difficult terrain that he used them against the Scots. Now, there was another type of mercenary in Ireland, much less attractive, the native Irish mercenary known as the cairn. Now, they inspired horror and revulsion from the very beginning of the 13th century until the 16th century. And they were the young, mainly noble or knightly class or well-off young men who had yet to come into their inheritance, who didn't have anything to do, and as there wasn't any cocaine in those days, they took to raiding. And they behaved absolutely atrociously. They raped and they pillaged and they burned and they beheaded and they spiked babies and whatever you can think of, they did it. By the end of the 16th century, they were known as the shower from hell, and the word cairn came to mean a bully or a tyrant. Now, the picture of armed struggle in Ireland in the 12th century needs adjustment. Irish military capability was probably undervalued, and that of the invading Normans overrated, particularly with regard to the use of cavalry. Heavily armed knights on massive war horses thundering down in close formation on the unprotected Gaelic forces had been thought to have had a huge advantage for the Anglo. The unequal contest, according to both Gerald of Wales and anonymous somewhat later Song of Dermot and the Earl, portrayed the Anglo-Normans as heavily armed with lances and long swords and spiked clubs, known as maces. They had powerful horses and lots of archers. We are told the Irish had short spears or slingshots, few horses, few archers, and either fought naked or in satin shirts, which I think is a lovely touch. As we have seen above, this was not so. The stipendiary lists that prove that they were given arms and a certain amount of armour and plenty of horses. Sorry, I got lost again. I will find it. And, in any case, the use of heavy cavalry was not the chief strategy of the English, neither in Ireland or anywhere else. As previously noted, holding true for the Irish style of combat, so for the English. And raids, forays, burnings, skirmishes were all on the menu. And here, clearly, light cavalry has the advantage, and particularly in the Irish countryside, with our bogs and the then forests, and the difficult terrain and the mountains. It's not the land, all right, you do have plains, but there's a huge amount of countryside which does not enable or give the advantage to heavy cavalry. Anyway, Henry II, in a reign of 35 years, and Henry, of course, was the titular overlord of Ireland, never fought a single pitched battle, either in Ireland or France or anywhere else. The knight sans pareil of the Middle Ages, William Marshall, throughout a military career spanning 40 years, only fought in 2 pitched battles. The Irish annalists, as well as Giraldus Cambrensis, describe the conflicts as small-scale plundering expeditions, which is probably why the Irish records don't pay any more attention to the arrival and sustained incursion of the Normans than they gave to the incessant native armed squabbles. We would be unwise to take Gerald at face value. However, his overall point of view of the Irish was that they were backward, barbarous, primitive, and pagan. Yes, pagan. Their military deficiencies were just part of the package. The English insistence on the decay of Ireland, their social and religious practices, along with military inferiority, particularly their riding style, which was much criticised, the fact that they rode bareback or on saddle pads. It was designed to explain, and above all to justify, the English invasion. Invasion, conquest and colonization of this formerly Christian nation, now agreed by all to have descended into barbarism, was clearly essential to impose change. Now, Ireland was no longer considered the insula sanctorum, but the insula barbarorum. How so? Probably the main reason is the time delay between 1066 and 1169. At the time of the Norman conquest of England, England and Ireland shared many bonds of common Christian heritage. The founding Irish saints, Patrick, Bridget and Colonial, were all known and revered by English Christians. There had always been differences, however, and Irish endemic warfare based on cattle raiding and slave taking, plus the monastic organization of the church as opposed to the English parish system, caused for calls of reform. In the 100 years after the Norman conquest of England, the voices calling for change became harsher, and the differences perceived as increasingly uncivilized. That is, for example, the English tended to ransom their captives, the ones who were worth ransoming, the wealthy ones. The Irish tended to behead them. The bloody nature of Irish dynastic quarrels also grated, and war as cattle raid was seen as archaic. Married clergy, hereditary bishops, unreformed liturgies were now perceived as abominations. Everything Irish was inferior. The backward state of the economy, lack of towns, the diet, the costume, and particularly the horse riding styles. Ireland was different. It was inferior. It was outlandish. The people lived filthily, and instead of hunting and hawking, preferred war as recreation. setting the Anglo-Norman invasion in the context of 12th century Irish warfare has provided a counter to the long-held assumption that the English intervention was a military turning point, and supports the view that domination is a much more subtle, rich-textured and many-faceted process than an over-concentration on a military storyline permits. Now, Giraldus Cambrensis commented, and don't forget, he was of that generation. He was our contemporary source for the Norman invasion of Ireland, and he was a Norman, an Anglo-Norman. Just as we are English as far as the Irish are concerned, just as we are English as far as the Irish are concerned, likewise, to the English, we are Irish, and the inhabitants of this island and the other one, England, assail us with an equal degree of hatred. Was this the beginning of the Anglo-Irish conflict?